Hello and welcome to Spotlight. A turning point in the months-long war between Russia and Ukraine. Russian President Vladimir Putin has signed the treaties on the accession of 4 Ukrainian regions. This follows referendums recently held in Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk, where people voted overwhelmingly to join Russia, a vote as expected not recognized by Ukraine and its Western allies. Kiev was quick to respond to Moscow's proclamation by announcing its application for accelerated membership in the Western military alliance, Nato. In this edition of Spotlight, we'll discuss what this move means for the Russia-Ukraine conflict and how it affects the growing tensions between Moscow and the West. Joining us on tonight's show, we have journalist, activist, and political analyst John Bosnich, joining us from Belgrade, and contributor at the Schiller Institute, Karel Vereycken, joining us from the French capital, Paris. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let's start off with Mr. Bosnich in Belgrade. Russia says that people in the 4 regions have voted overwhelmingly to join the Russian Federation. Ukraine and its Western allies, including the EU and the US, have called the referendums illegal and a sham. I want you to give us your perspective on the referendums and their ratifications by Moscow.
Well, first of all, this is just effectively a fait accompli. The accession of these territories to the Russian Federation was achieved by military means, but the important thing is that the people in those regions are fully in support of joining Russia and becoming members and citizens of Russia. The condemnation from the West is typical because they speak one thing and do another. If we talk about the United States itself, the entire country of the United States was stolen from its original inhabitants, and referenda were never used to take over territory. They simply stole it or took it by force of arms. And for the United States to be condemning Russia's efforts to involve the people in each of these decisions is simply not believable and not credible.
Let's cross over to our guest in Paris, Mr. Vereycken. UN Secretary General Antonio Gutierrez has described Russia's incorporation of the territories as a, quote, dangerous escalation and an illegal violation of the UN Charter. Talk to us about the legality of the move, and also touch up on the issue, as our guest in Belgrade did, as to why these regions have voted in favor of joining Russia so overwhelmingly.
Well, the Western narrative is increasingly Orwellian, and where peace is war and the world is upside down, because the nuance, the differentiation, which is really has to be made, is the difference between international order based on rules written exclusively by the West, and then on the other side, the international law as it was defined by the Charter of both the Atlantic Charter in 1941 and by the United Nations, which includes the self-determinations of people to know what kind of self-governance they want. So since this war has started in 2014, and that people in Kiev have been denying not only the Russian speakers but also the Hungarian speakers to use their own language to manage their affairs. Many of these Russian-speaking people in southern and eastern Ukraine, of course, felt like kicked out of their own country and are fully quite happy that they can be part of the Russian Federation. What I am really shocked with is the fact that there were at least over 100 of observers from foreign countries, including from South Africa, France, and other countries. And these observers, nobody is interviewing them. I got a report from a French observer who said it was just normal, and that contrary to that Mr. Blinken was saying, this is not on gunpoint, people push to vote. These are people happy to vote and finally relieved that they can now think about a better future.
John Bosnich, what does this accession by Russia mean overall for the conflict itself? How will this change the situation on the ground, in your opinion?
Oh, this is in fact a night and day change in the situation. Now that these territories have declared for membership in the Russian Federation and the president has signed a decree accepting their application, once the legal formalities are completed and the state declarations are circulated, then any attack by Ukrainian forces on these territories constitutes, at least in the eyes of Russia and its allies and the many other countries around the world that recognize the procedure of referenda, it constitutes an act of war against Russia proper. This could explain why President Putin called up so many reservists, because if Ukraine wants to attack Russia, then Russia will, of course, have to defend itself. And the result of Russia itself having to defend itself against Ukraine will mean a totally new phase in the war and could bring down the entire Ukraine regime in Kiev. That's really playing with fire. But of course, the decision is not being made by the marionette president that the United States put in power there, Mr. Zelensky, but it is being made in NATO headquarters, where they're trying to gauge how much further they can push this conflict, how many more weapons they can circulate, and how much more they can dominate the European allies of America ever since World War II. This is really a turning point where we see whether NATO cracks or whether NATO continues to oppress the entire region. This is the day.
Mr. Vereycken, Ukraine says now that it's applying for fast-track NATO membership following Moscow's formal integration of those 4 Ukrainian regions into Russia. I want to get your thoughts on this issue itself. Whether it will be heeded by NATO at this point, and what kind of a response also are you expecting to see from the likes of the U.S. and the EU and possibly the United Nations?
Well, I just watched the press conference of Mr. Stoltenberg in Brussels, and the most scary thing about this whole press conference is that he qualified the integration of these 4 regions as the most serious escalations since the beginning of the conflict. So instead of learning the lesson that this war is unwinnable and that the West should stop using the Ukrainians as cannon fodder, they keep insisting that this is all, that the Russians are the aggressor and that we cannot sign peace and that the West is supposed to fight to liberate these 4 regions, including Crimea, which is a special case and which is even, any professional diplomat would take out the Crimea issue out of a current ceasefire negotiation because it's a very complicated issue. So the most scary thing is on the one side, the blind attitude of NATO, and I would say on the other side the new element, which has been the sabotage of the gas pipelines close to Denmark.
John Bosnich, I want you to address that issue as well in terms of responses. U.S. President Joe Biden said Washington will never recognize what he called Russia's annexation of Ukrainian land. The European Union has vowed to never recognize the absorption, accused the Kremlin of jeopardizing global security. Give us your thoughts on the reactions and responses that we'll be seeing from NATO countries, from the United States, maybe even the UN.
Well, when a political leader says they will never recognize an act, that's a diplomatic code for impotence. It means that we can't do anything about it. We realize that we can't reverse it, but at least on paper, we're going to say we don't recognize it. This is effectively a day of victory for Russia. And I would also dispute Mr. Stoltenberg's comment about this being a critical increase in the crisis. In fact, what has happened here is the crisis is winding down because Russia has declared the inclusion of these territories into Russia proper. And this means that NATO now has to make a choice which they simply don't have the guts to make, which is to make war on Russia proper. They thought that they could twist arms. They thought that they could continue to pull strings and continue to do what they do best. Because what NATO does best is not fight wars, but sell weapons. Mr. Stoltenberg is probably on a percentage cut for weapons sales, and that's where he makes his money. And that's the same with many of the leaders in the NATO countries. Their job is to sell weapons, to sell fear, and to get their taxpayers to continue dishing out to a military-industrial complex that not only runs the wars, but it bribes the politicians and runs the Western world. This conflict in Ukraine is not just a turning point locally in Ukraine, it's a global turning point that the world is saying, not just Russia, but the world is saying, don't do it anymore. We've had enough. And that is significantly visible when you see that the entire rest of the world, the countries that are not military colonies of the United States inside NATO, the entire rest of the world is united against this NATO incursion into the back doorstep of Russia.
Mr. Vereycken, in recent days, multiple gas leaks have been discovered in the Nord Stream pipelines running from Russia to Europe. Vladimir Putin earlier accused the U.S. and its allies of sabotaging the pipelines. He said, quote, "The sanctions were not enough for the Anglo-Saxons, so they moved on to sabotage." And he added, "It's clear to everyone who benefits from this." Who will benefit from such a scenario?
Well, of course, the first benefiter will be some of the Polish stooges, because they have created this new Baltic pipeline to get gas from Norway into Europe. So I mean, we should, of course, the investigation will have to bring up new elements, but it is, I mean, this thing is really incredible, because first of all, the Baltic Sea is completely controlled by NATO. There were recent maneuvers, including on underwater drones, and even if they recognize that this was done by the Russians, it would be a total failure. Secondly, I mean, there were all the warnings from Mike Pompeo to Condoleezza Rice to Biden himself on February 7th, where he said they would never tolerate that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline would exist, because it would create a more integrated cooperation between Germany and Russia. Now Russia is losing, and maybe the pipelines will be definitely become unusable, because the seawater creates a lot of corrosion inside the pipes, and it will be very hard to repair them. But in this way, I mean, many people in Eastern Europe, in the Czech Republic, there were huge demonstrations in favor of trying to push the governments of Germany and others to open the Nord Stream pipelines and to come to a kind of deal and work out outside or get rid of the sanctions, because the winter is here arriving in Europe, and many people don't want to freeze. We want peace. We want to settle this question in a rational manner. And the big winner, the big loser in any case is Europe. And that's the new game changer, because if the United States and the forces behind NATO or the military industrial complex, if they start attacking the infrastructure inside the European Union, this is an entire new dimension of this global war.
John Bozich, Russia has time and again said countries supplying weapons to Ukraine and training its soldiers were in fact parties to the conflict. The question is, will this support ultimately result in this conflict spilling over into other regions and possibly turning into something bigger?
That's always a possibility if the conflict gets out of control. But it is not in the interest of any of the parties, including Ukraine, except perhaps for the joker president whose stay in power depends on the war continuing. What we've got here is a lateral expansion of the war into European territory. The attack on the pipeline, most likely done by England or America because they have the tools and the capacity to do it, is actually a militarized attack on the EU by non-EU members, England and America. Now, yes, the leaders of the EU are largely puppets of America and of England, and these puppets will not object. But the citizens of Europe should at some point be raising their heads up and saying, why are we putting up with this? Why are we continuing to elect leaders who do whatever they're ordered to do from Washington? So I would suggest that although there is a temporary setback in terms of cooperation between Russia and Germany, which is inevitable, that they will cooperate in the future, the temporary setback is pointing the finger at England and the United States, thereby distancing the people of Germany and the people of Europe from the Anglo-American Empire, which, if anything results from this war, the best thing that could result is that Europe becomes an independent territory again, no longer under Anglo-American foreign control.
Over to our guest in Paris, we're talking about the support that the United States and NATO has been giving to Ukraine. Is this support ultimately what the U.S. and NATO wants is the conflict to be prolonged and to see it dragged out for as long as possible in hopes that it weakens Russia? I want to get your perspective on that and whether they've been successful in your opinion.
Well, at the press conference, Mr. Stoltenberg, because the question was asked by a Ukrainian journalist if they would get the right for a fast track to enter into NATO, and Mr. Stoltenberg was very evasive and not saying that the doors are still open, but right now the issue is, as you say, just to give the means to Ukraine to defend its and to reconquer its territory. Now, on the ground, there were recent reports that even the U.S., the 155 millimeter cannons, ammunition, they're running out of ammunition. They are not producing the ammunition which is required on a daily basis by the Ukrainian army. So from that standpoint, there are skirmishes and things still going on the borders of these of these four provinces. But basically, the West has been destroying its own industrial base, including to produce some of these ammunition, which is not arriving, and therefore this whole idea that there is a big Ukrainian offensive now, it's somehow a big joke. And I think the attack on the pipeline shows that from the West, they are really desperate on the underground situation.
And one last question for you, Mr. Vereycken. This is an issue that Mr. Bosnich just mentioned moments ago about the purpose of NATO. I want to get your perspective as well. Why did NATO continue to exist following the collapse of the Soviet Union and at the end of the Cold War? What is the purpose of NATO today as we speak?
Well, the purpose of NATO during its creation, as there was one British lord who said, was the purpose was to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, which means in Europe, and the Germans down. That was the initial purpose of NATO. Today, I agree with, there was a British professor who said that the only purpose of NATO now is to manage the problems and the conflicts they are creating themselves. So we should put, and with my friend Mr. Cheminade in France, we're calling, and many other candidates have been calling, that France should do like de Gaulle and leave the integrated command of NATO, that we need a new international security order and financial order.
Okay.
That this thing is completely prehistorical barbarism. We should get rid of it.
All right, thanks a lot, gentlemen. That's all the time we have for tonight's show. John Bosnich, journalist, activist, and political analyst, joining us from Belgrade. And Karel Vereycken, contributor at the Schiller Institute, speaking to us from the French capital, Paris. And of course, a special thanks to you, our viewers, for staying with us on tonight's Spotlight. It's good night for now and see you next time.